dormitory, or great gardens of sleep. Lovely, but we've been talking, Julian's been talking about the resilience of the human body, and we thought it would be really interesting perhaps to update you all on our Urban Mind project, which talks about, and it's also a mayoral priority. If you want to count how many times he says well-being in his a city called London, as it happens to actually every page, he fails to check nature, but so we can't go there. I want to introduce Michael Smythe, Dr. Andrea Kelly, obviously Neil and I, we've been collaborating for a couple of years now on this project, which is to do with citizen science. So what's so fantastic is that we believe it kind of allows bringing together real-time information about how you feel and where you are, and how that can be really instrumental, both clinically and also in terms of affecting the way a city might grow, the priorities, and that again is linked to these places of great change.
Hello. So yeah, as Joe said, I'm Michael, so I'm one of the Urban Mind team. And I guess picking up on what you just said in terms of how landscapes change, I guess I was raised in a very sort of rural, urban environment. For the last 20, 25 years I've been living in immensely densely populated urban environments such as London, Chicago, likes. And it kind of, strange little hand, yeah, I'm kind of really struck by the effect that transition had on me in terms of my mental health, but also the way I engage with the landscape. At the moment, a lot of my practice is looking at the landscape as a material that I work with as an artist and producer, and very much interested in the legacy that one inherits in a way in terms of, as a young farm child, we learn about site custodianship and how to manage the land, and you know that you're just sort of one in generations of people. And I think taking that knowledge into cities as well is really important. And what it does is it kind of empowers you to kind of feel a responsibility, but also an awareness of the landscape. And I feel like that's something we need to bring back into the urban landscape, especially as we become more urbanized. Cities are growing at an incredible rate globally. 70% of the population live in urban environments in the next 20 or so years. So the impact and the kind of those environments, the impact they have upon you, is fundamental for physical and mental health. So this is a little example of a project that I've been working on for a few years called Phytology. It's a medicine garden based in Bethnal Green. It's an old churchyard turned bomb site, now turned cultural institute for learning about food, medicine, cultural heritage, plants. We, for a very small piece of land, it does quite a lot, but really what I'm talking about with this photograph is looking around it. There's very little kind of green infrastructure. So the site has to do a lot, and it does a lot in terms of air quality, water absorption, biodiversity, habitats, but also relief of stress, and kind of hopefully inspiration. So for me, working with a piece of land like this, there's a responsibility. And one thing that I'm very aware of is that people find that responsibility somewhat nostalgic, if not the project being nostalgic, and I find that slightly baffling, because it's actually a future proposition for cities. We need spaces like this. They are as important to me as hospitals and schools. And as soon as we start having that language, the more dynamic cities can be, and the more opportunities there will be for complexity within the human and non-human communities and cultures. So Urban Mind really, for me anyway, started off as a way to, how do I capture things that I totally know for me are a truth in terms of how these landscapes can make me feel and what they can do, but then capture empirical data that can communicate that. And there lied a bit of a gap that I thought that would be interesting to explore, and that's where the collaboration with Joe, Neil, and Andrea came about. And over the last few years of developing this project, the kind of research team has grown, in a truly cross-disciplinary way with all these different areas of research, which actually makes sense. You know, it's not being reductive. It's actually learning how to enjoy the complexity, and through that come up with ways to deal with a period in time that we've never been faced with before, in terms of climate change and in terms of population growth, and many other things. So what we decided to do is we applied for a grant through the Van Allen Institute in New York and Imperial College, and we won it. So we've developed this tool, per se, that's multifaceted, and it uses techniques that we would all use within our practice. You know, I occupy a site, I observe the site, I speak to people, and then I make work. Somewhat similar to what you do, and in Joe's case, he talks to the patient and works out ways to have early intervention or strategies that make sense. So we thought, well, that's a tool that is across all those different disciplines that I just showed you. So how can we put that within something that could actually move around and could harvest objective and subjective data side by side? So objective data, like you're sitting right here, and I know that the weather at this time is this, and the season. And then subjective data is in how you feel, what you think you're aware of, in terms of can you hear birds, can you see trees? You may be able to hear or see them, but you might not notice them, what influence that has upon you. So we developed, I guess, took forward an idea called ecological momentary assessment, which was used a lot in working with patients with schizophrenia or depression. And they had a device that would almost be like a pager. It would page them to put in data. Somewhat similar to when somebody comes up to you with a clipboard and goes, what do you think? Often, though, this stuff is retrospective. And we're self-delusional mammals, so we kind of just say what we think people want to hear, or in my case, what we've forgotten. So what this does is the Overmind app, I guess, sort of pings you several times a day over a period of time. And it asks you a very simple set of questions about how you are, where you are, what you see. And at the same time, we're capturing sort of data, locating data, and we can offset those two things. Within these questions, as I said, there are things like can you see birds, can you see trees, but also indexes of mental well-being, and we can sort of offset that against large data sets to kind of start making sort of ideas and manifest, such as the influence of trees upon your mental health when you're exposed to them, the influence of overcrowding, how that stresses you and the likes. So it's really kind of combining two different data sets and two different ways of thinking to a degree, and it's very helpful for me anyway, pushing the agenda of green infrastructure as an important thing alongside the health agenda. And it changes the dynamic in the way people see and appreciate that interaction. So this is two small screens from the app itself, asking about noise and whether you can see trees. And ergonomically, it's very, very simple, very icon-driven. So it probably takes about a minute to go through, and you just, especially after the second one, you can kind of see the image and sort of tap it with your thumb quite quickly. Colour slightly varies. And as Joe said, it's also encouraging citizen science. It really encourages you to kind of look and engage with the landscape. Other elements of the app is a sound recording device with decibels, so you can kind of almost be like in the field and record when you're in the train or at home. And that audio data is quite rich for us in terms of soundscapes, and also photographic data. It asks you to take a picture of the ground where you are, which also, in terms of what you were talking about, reveals quite a lot. We have two kind of sort of avenues within the app. If you are inside, it splits off to asking you questions about the quality of your internal environment, as does if you're outside, the quality of your external, whether you can see outside, what the air quality is like, and once again, obviously, how you feel within that. The audio and visual information is quite useful because it also encourages people to if you're asked to take a photograph of the ground, it encourages you, it's an invitation to stop and look. And after we did some initial trials of space that Neil and Joe designed in Dalston, and people returned after doing the app for a week, and we were actually quite surprised, especially after having months and months of trials and going through all the questions, that they actually enjoy being asked how they feel. and then over a period of time being more aware of how much they're indoors and when they're getting out. And those subtle kind of shifts of you being more aware of your interaction were quite nice. For some reason it's just stuck here.
But we should rename it IT learning.
This is so.
I've got a spinny circle.
Yeah. Anyway, so basically, so you can download the app. You get a 2-week period of research. You get 5 notifications per day. Hopefully, it's not too annoying to participants, but the more people stick with it, the more useful it is. We then also use social media to kind of push out the research really quickly. So when people do sort of offer up their time and effort, they can actually push it back out. And what it's doing is creating this sort of mosaic, in a way, of sound and visual and data. When we originally designed the app, we thought it would just be in London. I think naively, we also thought, just Londoners will do it. But suddenly it slipped. Before we knew it, people in Paris were doing it, and then Beijing, and then Qatar, and like pretty much everywhere in the world you get Wi-Fi, which kind of was a curious thing. So we had to dive back into the mechanics of it. Thank you. We had to dive back into the mechanics of it, and actually just change the language as to, because it was very London focused. But what that then allowed us to do, each 1 week represents one kind of ecological momentary assessment. What it's suddenly opened up is this whole new data set in terms of looking at all the geographic differences, all the cultural differences. It could be from temperature through to aesthetics of different cultures.
Working hours.
Sorry?
Working hours.
Yeah, working hours. And
Holiday hours.
That's another interesting thing in terms of the economy in London too. Making sure it's a 24-hour cycle that we can harvest from. It was the quality of people's lives vary greatly because London works 24/7. But then interestingly, like Adelaide, for instance, is an example, putting off London, climatically and environmentally very different, culturally there are similarities, but looking at certain design nuances between London or Seoul or Melbourne or Adelaide is kind of a curious opportunity to look at how we can design better cities, how we can encourage people, and especially policymakers to think of green infrastructure as an important thing within the city. And knowing, sort of talking about Wormwood Scrubs and where we're at the moment, this area going through massive change. And where is the parks agenda? Where is the kind of green infrastructure agenda within all this change? And we do know now, and thanks to tools like this, that these are important, valuable parts of the architectural landscape that must be considered. And the more that we all see that and understand that, the more we'll hopefully be able to influence the cities we're going to live in.
Michael, how are you intending to use that information to make those influences?
Oh, we'll come to that.
That's fine then.
I'm so glad you asked as an advertiser. If they don't answer it, come back to me later.
Yeah.
Hello everyone. My name is Decay, and I'm involved in this project from a mental health perspective. I work as a clinical psychologist in the South London and mostly NHS Foundation Trust, and I'm also a neuroscientist. I work at King's College London. My area is early intervention. So, in other words, how do we catch people early when they develop early warning signs, mental illness, early symptoms? How do we give them timely support so that they don't then suffer from a full-blown illness? So this is what we try to do, and I'm interested in this line of research because one of the most robust findings in my area is the link between urbanicity and mental health. We know that people who grow up in cities, people who maybe didn't grow up in cities but live in cities as adults, have higher risk of developing a mental illness. And especially specific mental illnesses such as depression and psychosis. So this is a very well-established finding. We also know that it's not just a psychological association. We know that there is a mechanism in the brain through which living in cities can affect mental health. This is an image from a paper that was published a few years ago in Nature, and it shows that when you live in a city for a long time, there is an area of your brain called amygdala, which is part of the limbic system, and which is important for processing stress. And this area shows hyperactivation, heightened activation in response to stressful stimuli. So when you've lived in a city for long enough, you seem to have an over-response to stressful stimuli. So we decided to develop this app and also the project more generally, because the project really is not something that is all about the app, it's wider than that. To try and understand which specific aspects of living in a city might be detrimental to mental health. And possibly, maybe there are aspects of living in cities which are useful, protective, beneficial to mental health. So we're trying to look at different dimensions of city living, testing for hypotheses that certain dimensions might be negative, certain dimensions might have a beneficial impact. So these are the main dimensions that we're looking at the moment. In the original version of the app that we developed a year and a half ago, we were mainly focusing on the built environment. So there were questions like, is it overcrowded? Can you see trees? But we realized that you cannot really segregate the built environment from the social environment, because the way an environment is built will inevitably affect how people interact in that environment, what kind of social activities take place in that environment. So the new version of the app, which will be available in the autumn, will look at both built and social environment. And so from my perspective, the clinical perspective, it's going to be very interesting to look at individuals who have a high risk of becoming mentally ill. These are clinically healthy people still, who don't have a psychiatric diagnosis yet, but they're showing early signs of illness, so they're very likely to become ill in the next few months. So we call them people at ultra high risk. And then we're going to use the app also in individuals that have just become ill, that actually developed psychosis, actually developed depression. So they have a psychiatric diagnosis. And we're going to get them to use the app for a certain amount of time, look at the kind of environments they are exposed to, and look at their responses, how they respond to these environments. And the idea is to then use all of this information to inform treatment. Something which is a bit of a hot topic now in medicine in general is stratified interventions. What this means is, rather than treating everyone in the same way, everyone who has a diagnosis, certain diagnosis, treated in the same way, we try and subdivide our patients in subgroups, with different subgroups who might benefit from different interventions. So this is what has already been done in cancer, to some extent, cardiovascular disease, and increasingly also in mental health. So the idea is to use information acquired through this app to then optimize treatment. For example, we may learn that certain individuals who show a very strong response to certain stimuli, they are at greater risk of relapse. Therefore, we will want to target those individuals. We will want to give them increased support to make sure that they don't relapse. So this is what I wanted to say from the clinical perspective. There are a number of other applications that we can talk to you about if you're interested. But the final point that I wanted to make is that really these results will be relevant not only to patients, not only to those individuals so-called ultra-high risk, but they will be relevant to all of us, because really mental ill, there isn't just a group of people who are mentally ill and a group of people who are healthy and they're just in different separate categories all the time. We are all along a continuum. Given the right stressors, certain life events, anyone can become mentally ill. And we all carry some gene risks, risk genes. We know there are hundreds of genes that give you vulnerability to mental illness. Inevitably, each of us in this room will carry some of them. So what this means is we're all along a continuum, and these results can help support mental health for everyone, and not just someone with a psychiatric diagnosis.
I'm so nervous about these. Yeah. So how do we put this into practice? One of the things we've found whilst we've been working on this project is that there is a real stigma when it comes to talking about mental health or talking about potential illness. People just almost don't want to know what the implications might be of new development, or indeed what the current status quo is of places that they may be custodians of. So we see there's potentially two levels of trying to influence policy at the highest level, so to try and make sure that in the case of London we're talking about the metropolitan scale, and then there's also on project by project basis, so it's being very site specific. And so I put together some hypotheticals about Old Common and Park Royal at the end of this, just to perhaps trigger some thoughts.
You've just gone into the ultra-high risk group.
Yeah.
You need to have cleansing.
It seems like I've tried to put on this slide.
I think that's what Andrea said is so important. We did recently have a presentation to a kind of more commercial group, and they said, oh, it's all this talking about mental wellness, and it seems a bit depressing. And we went, no, this is life. Everyone in their lives is going up and down. Things happen in your life. You feel good one day, you feel less good the next. It doesn't, as Andrea, have to be these polarised situations of either physical wellness and mental wellness. We're all one thing, and this is an environment, and so we need to kind of bring these things together.
Yeah. So this is definitely, the landscape we're in is influencing our presentation, because we do know it's quite damp in here, and it will be even damper when we go down to the catacombs. But so this is coming at it from a perspective that we've been involved in terms of developing policy with the Mayor's Office in London for the last 10-15 years. Quite timely in 2016, London's population exceeded its previous high, which was in the Industrial Revolution, so that was 8.8 million. We are on an increasingly denser trajectory. So there's a real need to be thinking about mental health alongside all of the other health benefits when we're thinking about cities and how cities grow. We worked on a project called the All London Green Grid, which was setting a context for all of London's open space. This is a project we did with the Mayor of London's office to embed safeguards in the London plan for open space. So this is London's kind of distribution of open space. It's quite interesting in one respect, because the sort of lighter green that you see is the kind of peripherals. I mean, it's no coincidence that this is largely green belt on the edges. That's private space. That's private open space within London. There's an awful lot of that. There are some fantastic larger spaces, such as the Lee Valley Regional Park, and then the Royal Parks themselves, which Mike knows so well. They provide very large open spaces, but what we find that when you have a drawing like this, which is effectively, it's a mapping of deficiencies in access to open space in London. So the darker the pink, the greater the deficiency. So that kind of goes down to, somewhere like the Lee Valley has a huge influence in terms of scale, but when you get to somewhere like where we are now, actually, which is very key, you've got a fairly dense bit of pin, probably one of the densest in the whole of London, compared to somewhere like here, which is obviously that's kind of in the city. So we know that the city is very dense and urban and very built.
Is that based on time too?
It's based on the criteria, so size of space and then walkable distance to those spaces.
Oh, okay.
So if you can imagine that the bigger the park, the sort of the standardised norm is that I think for a metropolitan park it should be within an hour's walk or something like that. Whereas a localised park, a pocket park, should be 10 minutes from this. So what this is really establishing is that in this area, the deficiencies, so this is the influence of Hyde Park, so it's kind of the white zone here. And then this is actually a real deficiency in terms of small-scale public spaces, spaces that have a real meaning to communities who live there, and not necessarily destination spaces. And when we're looking at this sort of mapping, the data sets we're using are very static. They're kind of generated on 10-year cycles linked to censuses. And we're interested in how we can maybe take the real-time data that an app or something like that might gather and superimpose that on that data. So you start to, we're not suggesting that this is a process where you throw out the traditional skills of city planning. You bring in an additional layer that helps complement and establish need. So this is a hypothetical. What happens if you were to then start thinking about well-being, and mental health is one of the layers of landscape infrastructure in the city. So this was a snapshot of our prototype. It's about 6 months old now. But we're kind of thinking, okay, so you have this strategy and you then think about it in policy. So mental health and well-being becomes embedded in strategic policy. But what does that mean when it comes down to real projects? So we're on the fringe of a huge project, the Old Oak and part of our opportunity area. Flows off the tongue. And so we are here, and this is again a hypothetical. So what we were starting to say, okay, we're going to gather data in the vicinity of Kensal Green Cemetery. And that data becomes another layer on the map. In the first instance, it establishes a baseline, so you're able to understand what the current condition is for people who live here, or people who visit here. The app is sophisticated enough in the way the questions are asked that you can start to pick out sections of questions and analyse those in more detail to respond to specific issues. But if we have this sort of information, these are kind of some of the initial findings. It's starting to, and I think you'll probably all agree that a lot of the stuff I'm going to say here seems very logical. There's actually very few scientifically validated papers which make this connection between access to nature, being able to see nature, being able to be in nature, and the benefit it has in terms of reducing stress. Does seem very logical, doesn't it? So what we're really interested in is finding a way to have that data to establish a baseline need. That then becomes a piece of information much like doing a photographic survey or thinking about how you might analyse how areas are responding to flood risk. So mental health and well-being as a baseline starting point. One of the, obviously there's kind of variations across age ranges, and we do ask some very simple demographic questions as part of the baseline. But one of the most interesting points, I think, is that we found in this pilot study is this idea of bioaccumulation. So if, for example, you get triggered to respond to a questionnaire and you're in a park setting, and you respond and your feedback in terms of stress levels are generally kind of quite moderate. If in the next scenario you're responding and you're in a busy street, you have a bioaccumulative effect from that previous experience of nature or previous experience of landscape. So you're carrying with you that positivity in terms of the access you've had to nature in that sense. So you think about somewhere like Kensal Green Cemetery, you've got this historic juxtaposition of different neighbourhoods. So the cemetery parkland of Kensal Green juxtaposed against some of these pieces of industry that were to follow this site. There's always been that balance between the built and the built and the sort of semi-natural, and that's true very much in the cemetery itself. You then have somewhere like Wormwood Scrubs, which in its scale is offering something entirely different, and it's a different type of landscape, but it still has a value that's perhaps not as obvious to somebody who's thinking about master planning an area, but that value is still very important. You have smaller micro scale in terms of biodiversity, and then you have the scale of change in terms of infrastructure. So we're thinking here very much about traditional transport infrastructure sitting alongside the marine infrastructure.
10 minutes away from where we are.
Yes, so I'm going to set you some homework at the end of this. We have made a map, but so this is the site of High-Speed 2 Crossrail Interchange at Old Oak. It's the only place where those two lines meet in the network.
It used to be Eurostar speeding.
Yeah. So yeah, you will see, we've seen it out on that line towards Bath and just it's a phenomenal amount of transport infrastructure, and that's very much how this whole area has evolved as part of London, subdivided by transport infrastructure, with spaces in between the communities in between, and industry in those pockets too.
And it was one of the oldest oak woods in London
Yeah.
before it became this.
And that, yeah, that's.
You may be coming to it, sorry.
No. Well, I wasn't going to mention that it was. There's a very good report that I would certainly recommend in Darren Roads. It's by English Heritage in their former version of about this area, and it's a response to the Old Oak Common proposals, and it does a very non-partisan analysis of the evolution of this part of the city. There's lots of references. I mean, Acton, which was Oak Town, was the derivation of Acton. It's not too far away, so it was a very heavily wooded place. I might just about run out of light, which is not it. There's a couple more slides. But what we've got through next door on the table is a map, and this map is a kind of it's a sort of ramble that we did with Stephen when we were scoping out today's when we were scoping out today's activities, and we walked through the opportunity area, we walked through the fringes of that, which is Wormwood Scrubs. So the kind of itinerary for you to do. It's a little bit of extracurricular landscape learn, do whenever you fancy really. But I think it's important to go and walk these neighbourhoods on the cusp of change, to record them yourselves and get an idea of the scale of change that we're experiencing here. There's quite a unnerving drawing in terms of scale comparison in one of the master plan reports, which looks at the opportunity area and then sort of copy and pastes it around London to show you how big it is. It's equivalent of sort of the Emirates Stadium, Highbury, halfway down to King's Cross in length. It's a huge part of the city, and it's very difficult to get an idea of it at the moment because you're on the fringes of a lot of this as you walk through the site. And I think it's crashed because I did have some pictures of what's proposed. That's maybe what it's done.
It's
yeah.
awful.
But the scale is phenomenal. 55,000 new jobs, 25,500 new homes, and it's really gigantic in its impact. And that then puts pressure on the existing open spaces and landscapes. And it's the sort of challenges that you have places that need to be thinking about quality as well as quantity. So Wormwood Scrubs is a giant space, but what is that offering? And this is again where we think maybe thinking about it in terms of well-being as well as physical activity and all the other benefits is something that's really important. I'll give up the beach ball.
Maybe that's a good, we'll leave that
Yeah,
up to do its
still,
own
yeah.
life. Thanks. And maybe it would be a good point to introduce Teresa, who's been looking, because when we're talking about space, it's not quantity, it's quality, it's what's meaningful for neighbourhoods. It's a sense of history, a sense of identity, a sense of connection with those places. And so Teresa, do you want to come and talk about your work?